Kings are like stars, they rise and set. They have the worship of the world, but no repose. Percy Bysshe Shelley. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to thank you all for joining me this week. I appreciate the support. If you're a newcomer, welcome. I hope you will peruse our backlog of episodes, and if you're a returning listener, thank you guys as always for your continued support. I do want to go ahead and apologize for not having an episode out this week. I did mean to have one out either Monday or Tuesday night. However, I just got caught up with a lot of stuff going on at work, and I really didn't have time to sit down and record and make sure that all my notes were organized. So apologies for that. This week also was crazy. There was a very large winter storm here in the U.S. I'm sure some people may have heard about it. Thankfully, I'm far south enough where I have been spared most of it. However, it is cold enough that we have had a little bit of snow, and a lot of the kind of the sleet and freezing rain are going to cause icy conditions. So my work tomorrow has been delayed. So it'll be a little bit of a delay for me, so I can stay up a little bit later tonight and get this recorded and get this out. So I'm going to try and make this a little bit longer episode. So I think we're going to finish up the Neolithic cultures of Central Europe, France, and Germany. Then we will probably start to look at kind of the emergence of the Neolithic in what is now Scandinavia and those cultures. And then we'll do the Baltic, I believe, the parts of the Baltic and kind of Northern Europe that we kind of touched on the border regions of when we were talking about the steppe and Eastern Europe. But once we get those two regions done, we're going to move to the British Isles and Ireland, and then we will move to the Americas, and we will be finishing up the season. And at that point, we are going to have to kind of reorganize how things are done, because we're getting to the part of our story here where we actually have written history, or at least proto-history in some places. And that's going to cause things to kind of be a little bit different organizationally for how I present things. But that's all for the future. Let's go ahead and dive on in and finish talking about the Neolithic cultures of Germany, France, Central Europe between the years of 6 and 4000 BC, BCE, whichever you prefer. Now, if you recall our last couple of episodes, we talked about the end of the linear pottery culture and how, as it was giving rise to several successor cultures like the STK or the stroke ornamented ware or the Lingel or the Rosen culture, another culture is emerging from the remnants, the final holdouts of the old linear pottery culture. And these are in its western kind of extremes. And from what we can tell, this culture, which is the Michelsberg culture, or the Michelsberg culture, depending on the translation you're using, this is a combination, at least from what we can tell from DNA tests, of individuals who had moved up from the Mediterranean basin. They had moved up from the Mediterranean coast, up the river valleys into central France, near what is now Paris. And they had mixed with Neolithic farmers who had come in as part of the waves of the old linear pottery culture migrations. Probably very closely related to the Cyrenaic culture, if you remember them from a few weeks ago. So this mix between, again, probable people related to the Cyrenaic culture, the old linear pottery holdouts in the very western extremes of their territory, they kind of mix together. And they may have done this due to the pressure being put on them by the former hunter-gatherers who had begun to adopt some of the Neolithic lifestyle and had really begun to embrace it along the Atlantic coast in Europe. And the Michelsberg culture, it emerges, again, very close to what is now modern-day Paris, where you do see the Cyrenaic culture emerge, which, again, it is a mix of, those old hunter-gatherers who had interbred with the hunter-gatherers. Then you have the hunter-gatherers who had adopted the Neolithic lifestyle, and then you have the linear pottery culture. So very much a mix of 2 to 3 very different groups. Though at this point, again, by the time the Michelsberg culture emerges, which is around 4,400 BC, all of these cultures had been practicing agriculture and herding for quite some time, though maybe not necessarily in this region. But once the Michelsberg culture emerges, they begin to expand very quickly. However, they do not expand towards the coast, again, where you see the heavier genetic legacy of hunter-gatherers who adopt agriculture. Instead, they back migrate to where the linear pottery culture had come from and where the Rossen culture was primarily located. And they do this very quickly. Within just a couple of hundred years of kind of emerging along the Seine River, they kind of they begin to expand back to the Rhine. They occupy both sides of the Rhine River, and even they get almost back into, they do get back into kind of the headwaters of the Danube as it begins to flow into what is now Austria. Though that happens, I think, a little bit past the point of this season's ending. The Michelsberg culture lasts quite some time. It's about 900 years. So about from 4,400 to about 3,500 BC. But it is a very successful culture. And it kind of reaches its heights, at least in its primary territory, at this point of the season. And of course, they do not just migrate back east. They also move a little bit further north. They get into what is now Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and also there is some debate if they're the ones who help export agriculture into Scandinavia, or if that was the Rossen culture who preceded them by a couple hundred years, and then they just help continue spreading it after people from the Rossen culture moved in the area. But that's stuff we'll talk about when we get to our episode on... We'll talk about that when we get to Scandinavia. Maybe a little bit later this week. It may be next week. We'll just have to wait and see. Their economy, again, fairly standard Neolithic fare. They have the full range of domesticated animals that you would expect: cattle, pig, sheep, and goats. They did also hunt. Bones of deer and foxes have been found at their site. So hunting was at least a semi-important supplement for their protein and things like that. Their pottery is very simple, but it is well made. Now, they didn't really decorate it the same way that you've seen some of these other cultures decorate their pottery. It's very utilitarian. However, they did have a very wide variety of shapes and sizes, and the most, stand out design that they used are what's known as tulip beaker designs, and that is exactly what it sounds like. It looks like a tulip plant. Very wide mouth, and then it narrows down to a bottom, usually curved, although I think they have found some that may have been flat as well. But they had plenty of shapes and sizes. They had dishes, they had other jugs and things like that. And eventually they do start to decorate some of them with dots and things like that on the edges. But that appears to be kind of a later addition, at least from the ones I've seen. Most of those are dated kind of towards the end of the culture. In terms of color, very basic. It's either a dark brown or a light brown, possibly some white in as well. But again, those could have been stained by the earth while they've been in the ground. They also had jewelry made from stone and bone, and there is evidence of long-scale trade. They have found numerous jade artifacts, and jade is not native to the region. This would probably have come from places further south, either from Italy or also maybe the Chassin culture, which we talked about being kind of a little bit further south in France. So they had trade links to peoples further south. They also did have found some small number of artifacts from contemporary cultures in Iberia, though obviously I don't think the Michelsberg culture was directly trading with them. That is, again, probably coming up from the trade routes from France. This would have been a stone known as varicite, I believe. It's kind of like it's like a very, very pale version of lapis lazuli. At least that's, it's kind of in that same color gradient, but again, a lot paler. I think it's also sometimes referred to as clay as well. I think, and this is type of jewelry is going to be made for quite a while in the region. I mean, we're talking even into Roman times and later. It's mentioned by Pliny the Elder, just as a frame of reference. So it's still a very popular material, as time goes on. They were also probably involved in trading salt as well. Now, their settlements are fairly interesting. We found quite a few of them. And some of them get fairly large and fairly early in their timeline as well. Some, in just a couple of hundred years, they're fairly large. However, the largest that has been found is the settlement known as Kapellenberg, and this is near Frankfurt. And it got around 4000 BC. It was fairly large. In fact, it was almost to the point of what you could call a city. Again, we've talked about the definition of a city. Doesn't appear that it had like a central, administrative center or anything along those lines. At least not that we've been able to determine. But the site, again, it took up around 45 hectares, and that's just all of the area being used by the settlement. But the actual, core of the settlement with homes and buildings and things like that, took up about 26 of those hectares. And they had, several rectangular houses of varying sizes, and it was surrounded kind of by a large rampart. And there's topological maps I'm going to include in the YouTube episode, as well as a picture of the mound as it appears today. And it's overgrown now, but it's really very steep how high up it got compared to the lowlands around it, which is, again, probably where they're performing their agriculture and herding and things like that. Also, for their homes, they did use wattle and daub, as you would expect from Neolithic settlements, but at some sites, past a certain point, you begin to see new types of construction methods being used, post and beam construction. This is sometimes referred to as timber framing. And if you look, this is a very long-lasting tradition in Europe. If you think of those whitewashed houses with the sloped roofs, and you've got all those kind of wooden beams you can see on the exterior, that's kind of what you're looking at. Now, was this like a direct, transmission from the Michelsberg culture to other cultures, or is this something that they developed that maybe a couple of other cultures began to use? Or was it developed independently at different times? I haven't really traced it that thoroughly yet, but they're the first to use it. And this is a type of construction you'll see in a lot of, especially stereotypical houses in a lot of places in Central Europe and in the mountains and things like that. That when you picture an old rustic mansion or townhouse or something like that. Like that's the kind of construction that would come to mind for a lot of people. Now, obviously, that's not universal. At least in the U.S., though, I feel like that's kind of like an idealized version of a house, like somewhere in the Swiss Alps or the German Alps or somewhere like that. But again, that's kind of a later addition to the Michelsberg site, so that's not something you see at the outset, at least from what I was able to read. And I could be wrong about that. Some of the sources I'm reading on this are a little bit older than others. You'll also see at some of these sites burial spots for resources. In some cases, they would use pits to store different types of material, food, and things like that. That shows another factor with some of these Michelsberg sites where they are intentionally abandoned. At least it appears that they're intentionally abandoned. And it meant that people, maybe did plan to return. You don't see too much evidence of intentional destruction at many of these Michelsberg sites. Why they're abandoning these sites is they may have been very reliant on rainfall in some of these areas as opposed to irrigation. So sometimes the environment in an area may not have been conducive to these larger populations that some of these sites may have had. And some of the, like I mentioned, the site of Kapellenberg, and there was another one, I believe, it's Schierstein, I think was one. These could have had several thousand people living there. So, depending on, the size of your population, a little bit of disruption in the environment may have caused, a lot of problems. Even if, it's not that bad, for a smaller group, for a larger group, it could have been devastating. But now that is not to say that there is no evidence of violence in these places. We'll get into some of the, dead we found, but it doesn't look like the Michelsberg culture was having to deal with large-scale attacks on their settlements. At the very least. At least there's no evidence of that's been found. And that's probably due to the construction of their settlements. Again, they've got these very steep embankments, ramparts is what they're called, and these were fortified usually with gates at the entrance points. And they would not be easy to scale, especially by smaller groups maybe around the Michelsberg locations, at least the larger ones. There are other theories regarding this. There have been some remains found kind of in these ditches or pits on the very exterior of these walls. Some people think, these people may have been killed attempting to enter. That's not a super popular theory because of there's also evidence that their graves may have been kind of separate, or at least burial pits may have been kind of on the exterior of the settlement, and then they got washed away into these ditches where rubbish was contained due to like rain and just the earth shifting. That's a possibility because some of these remains are very broken up. So it's possible they got jumbled around, with the earth shifting and water rushing around them. Now, they have found some, deliberate burials, and these are, fairly well prepared. Though, who's buried in these is a little interesting as well. It's limited to children who were very young, under, I think it was 9 years of age, and adults over 50, which at the time, that we're talking about, the average age of an adult is not 50. It's considerably less than that. So these were very old individuals for the time. So they were probably very well respected, and of course, the children, people love their children regardless of the age you live in. Despite some instances where that's not as apparent, but in general, people care about their children, and when they die, it's a sad thing, especially if they got to the part, of their life when they're, beginning to really grow and become an individual. And that you can tell that from the respect that they're showing these remains. Now, they don't really have an organized burial area the same way that LBK and the Rossen culture do. These burial grounds where they're putting these individuals are kind of haphazard. They're spread around. There's not like any kind of overarching funeral practice that kind of links all these people together. At least not for these types of individuals. Now, as time goes on, they do begin to build these tumulus mound tombs, and we talked about those in the some of the French cultures we talked about the last couple of weeks, the Chassin and the Cernay culture. And the Michelsberg culture, again, they do begin to construct these tumulus mound tombs. However, the individuals who are buried there are they are all male, at least that we found, and they appear to be, of an older age, and they are buried with very lavish grave goods, these jade axes, things like that. So it does appear that there was some type of hierarchy organized around these men. So this is an area, again, where you're beginning to see a stratification, at least, of importance around male individuals, as opposed to, this Neolithic supposed matriarchal society that was prevalent in all of Europe before the arrival of Indo-Europeans and other horse peoples from the steppe. And later, they'll also begin to use stones similar to the megalithic stones you saw in places like Brittany, the Karnak stones, things like that. So this is also something else that's coming west from this kind of Atlantic region. So this is adopted later as well. So this has led some to believe that these type of tumulus mounds, where these male individuals, they may have been kings, priests, kings, some mix of them, though again, that's all speculation. There's no real evidence if they had religious power, secular power, or both. But given what we know about other societies, I would hazard a guess that it is both, at least to some extent. Now, were they, absolute monarchs? Probably not. A lot of tribal societies and early Neolithic societies, there is some type of, mix between kings and, elders, and what the exact power of a king is depends on the time, the place, and the individual king. Some individuals are probably more commanding than others. We'll get into this when we talk about kingship, of course, but some individuals just aren't made to be king. But they're king anyway, so you have to make do with that. They have to make do with that, and the people that they nominally rule over have to make do with that. Though at this early stage, there's also no evidence that these kings are necessarily related to each other. I don't know that there's been any DNA tests done to show if these individuals are all related to each other, and if they are related to each other, how are they related to each other? Is it a case of a son succeeding a father, a brother succeeding a brother, or a nephew succeeding an uncle? Is it like the oldest person in a specific lineage? Is it just the best warrior who's elected by a council of elders? We don't know. And it could be any number of these things. And again, depending on the time, it may be all of these things, depending on, what century of the Michelsberg culture you're dealing with. But regardless, aside from the tumulus mound sites, there's not a big overarching connection between burials of other individuals between the Michelsberg sites. It seems like they each maybe had their own local traditions. Some cases have been found where you'll see adults kind of buried in the center of one of these burial locations, with children kind of surrounding them. Others you'll see artifacts offered up just in the area surrounded by people, so maybe the individuals don't carry them, but you'll find horns of wild cattle, stones for grinding millet, kern stones I think is what they're called. And then in some cases there may be evidence of human sacrifice at the site in Rasheim or Bas-Rhin in France. They found a pit where a woman was kind of crouched over one of these kern stones, and she had been laid on these packs of clay lumps and pottery and bone, and she had been killed by impact to the back of her skull by some blunt object. So this could have been evidence of human sacrifice. But again, this is just one individual. And it's only found at that one site. So again, there's a lot of variety in the burial practices outside of these megalithic tombs and tumulus mounds in the Michelsberg sites. Another theory regarding some of their burial practices may be that the reason you don't find certain individuals, buried in these kind of graves for the elderly and children is that they may have practiced a type of excarnation, where you leave the dead exposed to the elements. This is done in several places. Tibet, there are peoples there that have practiced that in the past. I don't know if it's still practiced there currently. Parts of what is now Iran, that was done by different people. Not too unusual. And that also might explain why some of these, bits of individuals have been found in these ditches. Maybe they got dragged there by animals as they were, exposed to the elements. But again, this is all just speculation. Now, the Michelsberg culture is going to continue into next season, but I will go ahead and spoil some stuff for you, and we'll touch back on this. But basically, the last 500 years, again, some of their sites are abandoned. It appears they plan to come back, but that doesn't happen. But then other sites just continue on, and they enter new cultural phases. Some of them, go down one path, and the others go down other paths. So there's no real evidence of a massive violent end for the Michelsberg. It just kind of breaks apart into different regional groups as these different parts of the Michelsberg culture react to these other cultures surrounding them. And the lack of a coherent, for lack of a better term, religious or ceremonial life when it comes to the dead maybe means that they weren't necessarily the most tight-knit group to begin with. But that's all for future episodes. For now, let's see where we are. It's about 30 minutes. Let's go ahead and move into Scandinavia. This will also take us back to the start of this season's timeline, 6000 BC. Now, at this start of this season, Scandinavia is basically divided between a northern and a southern tradition. These aren't really considered cultures per se, though they're called cultures, but also you'll see the term tradition kind of put in there. Basically, how their stones are knapped and broken and designed and what tools they're using in terms of shape and size, that is what defines their tradition. There's no overarching pottery or anything to go by at the start of this season. And I think there might be some pottery towards the end, but we'll get there. Also, in this sense, Scandinavia is just what is now the modern countries of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Finland is probably in there as well, though, depending on the time frame, Finland might be more part of the Baltic than Scandinavia. at this time frame, I'd hazard a guess that they're probably a little bit more culturally related to the Balkans. But we'll get there when we talk about the Balkan stuff. But again, there's basically northern traditions in what is now Norway and kind of the northern parts of Sweden, and then there are southern traditions in Scandinavia, and this includes Denmark, the very southern part of Sweden, Scania or Skane, depending on who's describing it. And I know I butchered that pronunciation. I'm sorry, my Swedish and Danish listeners. And there's also parts of these traditions in what is known as Zealand, which is now, I believe, part of Denmark and northern Germany as well. Now, the northern traditions have different names depending on the country referring to them. There's the Nostvet name, the Nostvet culture, and the Liholt culture. Nostvet is the Norwegian name, and Liholt is the Swedish name. And they're very similar. They probably weren't, exactly the same peoples, though they obviously descended from the same group that had been living in the area for quite some time. And this lasts from around 7,000 or so to about 5,000, 3,200. There are a couple of semi-permanent settlements in what is now Sweden. I believe it's near Gothenburg. That settlement was used pretty regularly between 7,000 and 5,000. But the culture or the tradition and how they're crafting their tools and what they're making their tools out of continues past that point. It's just that site is abandoned. And they do begin to use microliths, which are, again, the smaller, thinner blades as the megafauna are beginning to die out. And they are primarily hunting marine mammals. They're getting waterfowl, fishing, gathering, all that kind of stuff. And as they grow over time, they become more and more sedentary. And they're using quartzite, and flint for their tools. Now, the southern culture that we're first going to talk about is a little bit younger, and it lasts from around 6,000 BC to about 5,200. And this is the Kongmos culture. And just want to make sure I'm clear on this. This is also parts of, again, Scania, or Skane, where this existed too. So this is Sweden and Denmark, as well as Zealand, northern Germany. And then the Liholt culture is a little bit further north in Sweden. They also were beginning to use microliths during this period. They had their arrowheads are fairly interesting design, and those actually have a picture that actually has a fairly wide variety of the tools they're making. But they're not just using stone; they're using bone. Their economy was primarily based on hunting deer, boar, and they did fish as well, but it wasn't their primary source of protein the same way it was for the Nostvet and the Liholt. Both cultures are probably using dugout canoes to kind of sail up and down the coasts to fish. Probably not getting very far off, but that's not surprising, again, based on the technology they had available to them. And despite them both beginning to make smaller blades, they are still considered part of Mesolithic Europe, because they are still, of course, making larger tools as well. They're not getting rid of those entirely. Now, starting around 5,400 BC, give or take 100 years one way or the other, the climate begins to warm in at least Denmark and southern Sweden. This makes food a little bit more abundant, and it leads to developments from the Kongmos culture to what is now known as the Urtebol culture. And there's also another culture, it's called the Swifterbond. This is kind of the regional variation in what is now the Netherlands. and that comes from the type site of Swifterband in, again, what is now the Netherlands. And this was actually underwater until it was drained by the Dutch, I believe. It was part of an island before it was connected to the mainland. The oldest skeleton found in the Netherlands belonged to the Swifterband culture. This individual has been named Trente, and I hope I didn't butcher that pronunciation. The name means something like, there's a couple of different supposed origins for the name. Supposedly there was a woman who lived near there who was named Trente, and they just named it for the woman who lived near the excavation site. And another story is that one of the students said they called it that because a lot of modern trains were moving nearby, and it's like a treinen in Dutch. So I'm not sure what the actual origin of the name is, and it doesn't sound like anyone's 100% sure one way or the other. But she lived to a very old age. She was born sometime around 5,500, and she lived to approximately 50 years old. And she was 5 feet 2 inches tall, which is 1.58 meters. Her teeth were fairly worn from probably eating a lot of coarse food and also using it to, process animal hides. She looks to have given birth to at least one child, and probably more, given her advanced age. And around her, there were decorations of red ochre. So probably some type of grave goods were included with her burial as well, in addition to a lot of remains of duck, swan, geese, herons, a lot of waterfowl, that were likely hunted by her kin and her family for survival. Now, interestingly enough, the Swifterband culture is actually fairly new in the region, at least from the archaeological evidence. It doesn't look like, at least we haven't found evidence that they were there prior to the Rassen culture. It looks like that region was kind of a middle ground between the two, though there's not much evidence for direct interaction between the Rassen and the Swifterband, or even the Ertebal culture. But there probably was at least some level of interaction between them. But they're getting further south now that it's warmer. It's probably easier to travel, more comfortable. So they're expanding kind of similar to how the linear pottery and the Rassen cultures were expanding into the north. And I'll include kind of a reconstruction they've done of her based on her bone structure. They have a kind of in one of the museums, they have a kind of a display based on what she looked like when she was found, if she had not decayed. But the Ertebal culture and the Swifterband culture, they are still classified as Mesolithic because there's not a whole lot of evidence for domesticated crops yet. And their tools really haven't changed all that much. However, they are hunting, fish a little bit further out. Whitefish, cod, eel have been found. They've also begun to develop pottery. Now, their pottery is not based on the linear pottery or the Rassen cultures. It actually came to them from the Baltic. It's kind of made in a very similar style to some of the Baltic cultures we'll talk about. But, fairly coarse, but, not especially poorly made. It's serviceable. It's utilitarian. No big decorations or anything like that. They're sometimes referred to as bulb pottery, and you'll see why. I'll have a picture up. But they came in different sizes, some as small as 8 centimeters, some to as tall as 50, and they could range from 5 to 20 centimeters in diameter. Excuse me. Apologies for that cut there. I was coughing very badly. They did have some decoration. It looks like they were using their fingernails or their fingertips to kind of impress like horizontal bands. They made their pottery via the coil method, so they would make a circle of their material, and then they'd stack it up, and they'd basically fire it over raw coal. And it was used from they make it from local clay and sand. So they're developing their own pottery outside of the tradition of the linear pottery or the Rossen cultures. And then they would, of course, have impressions for cord marks and animal bones as well. But that doesn't really show up too well on the pieces they found. You have to really examine them close up to be able to see it. If you just look at a picture, you probably won't notice that decoration. And some pieces are not decorated at all, at least that we can see. They're also making lamps, very small, kind of boat-shaped objects that they were putting in either blubber or seed oil, things like that. They're also making jewelry from polished antler or bone. Some of it is believed to look anthropomorphic or kind of like certain animals, maybe. I haven't been able to find any good pictures of those. I'm going to try again before I post the YouTube episode, but that is something that is believed. They are making at least animal and human motifs with some of their artistic expression. In addition to hunting and fishing, the same way they had been, there are evidence of more plants in their diet than the earlier Kong Moss culture. This is because, again, the environment's a lot more amenable to that sort of thing. They're getting wild raspberries, strawberries, crab apples, things like that, as well as numerous others. They're making gruel from ground acorns and other things like that. No evidence, from what I could tell, of agriculture, at least at the period that we're referring to. There may have been some towards the end, but very little evidence of that. Also, no evidence of domesticated animals, at least that I saw mentioned. But they're going to last from around, again, 5,400 to about 3,900 or so, give or take 100 years. So they're gonna disappear in this upcoming season, or next season when we get back here. Now, their burials, they didn't really have an overarching practice. Some groups apparently practiced cremation. Others would be buried at kind of family sites. Now, there is also the earliest evidence of boat burials, where an individual was put in a dugout canoe, and then that canoe was buried. So that is, Scandinavian boat burials, very old practice, and this is something that's going to continue basically to the medieval period. And it does appear that the women were given their necklaces and jewelry when they were buried, and men were buried with things like axes and things like that, and they were all kind of decorated with red ochre and deer antlers and things like that. And I think that's it for Scandinavia. So we have gotten through 2 regions here tonight. I know Scandinavia was a little short of things to talk about, but that's because it's hunter-gatherers. I hit the high points, not to, again, demean their lifestyle or anything like that. There's just less kind of stuff you can nail down about that without going into minute detail on how they're napping their flint and their quartz and things like that. And that's something I'm not very well versed in and can't really talk about in too much detail. Trying to think if there's anything I missed. Oh, going back to the Michelsberg culture. There is no evidence of them having copper at any of their sites. In fact, well, there's not much evidence. Most of their sites, there's no copper at all. However, some have found small amounts of copper, but there is theories that they may have had a aversion to it, like a cultural aversion to using copper. But again, that's just a theory, and once they begin to break into these separate cultures, they'll all adopt copper in their own time. But the Michelsberg culture itself, there's not a lot of evidence for them using copper for any type of decoration or anything like that. So that is something that they may have had a cultural aversion to. At least that's one theory. So, but yeah, I think that's it for this week's episode. It's a nice long one. I hope you guys have enjoyed. And I hope you will return next week where we will talk about the Baltic cultures. And we'll might move into Great Britain as well and talk about them. And then after that, which shouldn't be more than 2 weeks, if that, we'll be moving into the Americas once again. But I do appreciate you all for coming out and listening. If you have any questions, comments, constructive criticism, please let me know. You can reach out to me at waradrevpod@gmail.com. You can also contact me via direct message on X/Twitter, and you can leave a YouTube comment, and I will see it there. We are getting close to 400 subs on YouTube. I would appreciate if you do listen to me there, dropping a sub, and if you are listening to me on one of our audio-only places, please rate, like, 5 stars, all that kind of good stuff, and it helps the show grow, and I would appreciate it very much, almost as much as I appreciate you just listening to this episode. But until next time, I hope you all have a good rest of your week and weekend, and we will see you all next time. Peace.